Okay, so this week's class is on Clash of Civilizations, the title of one of our readings, and The End of History, the title of the other reading. I'm going to start off by going through the main arguments that both of these authors make, Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington, and then we're going to look at what are the assumptions underlying these arguments, why these arguments resonated, and finally, where does the argument stand today? So, let's get into it. Francis Fukuyama publishes The End of History with a question mark in 1989. It was a particularly timely article because as he was finishing writing his article that year, it appeared that what was happening around reinforced his assumptions and his claims. The Berlin Wall fell, Soviet Union dissolved just 2 years later. The world was changing. The Cold War was over. And his argument, which was read as a very optimistic argument in many ways, which it really isn't, we'll take a look at exactly what it says in a moment, seemed to resonate in particular in academic and policy circles. It seemed to propose a different world vision, the one that we could export again and again and again. So let's take a look at what it actually had to say, or what he had to say specifically. So his central claims, and you have read the articles at this point, I'm sure, so you're quite familiar with them, but it is worth rehearsing some of these claims that are being made. So his main claim, and the reason why he proposes that perhaps we are at the end of history, as he says, is that at the end of this last century, it appeared, and perhaps it really did appear, and he certainly believed what he was writing, and many agreed with him, that Western liberalism and Western democratic ideas had won the day. Communism was gone, fascism was gone, although we'll take a look at those in a minute as well, but it did appear that, as he put it, the triumph of the West, of the Western idea, is evident first of all in the total exhaustion of viable systematic alternatives to Western liberalism. There have been other alternatives to Western liberalism. There will be future alternatives to Western liberalism. Fukuyama, though, was very sort of myopically imagining that literally Western liberalism was the epitome and the point, the convergence of all of our human endeavors. And so he did argue this, and he argued it very seriously, and like I said, his argument was picked up by many others, that the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy is the final form of human government. Apparently, we have nowhere further to evolve to. Democracy, Western liberalism, premised upon consumption and capitalism, are the best we can hope for. If you're a historian, if you were a historian then, if you're a historian today, you'd be appalled. History doesn't stop because someone announces it stops. But many academics, especially social scientists, who were very invested in this idea that we in the West had come up with something so powerful and potent that it literally could end history, and then all we had to look forward to was repeating what we've done before, really liked Fukuyama's argument. It was very obviously Euro and Western centric, but it was also particularly self-congratulatory. It implied that we had somehow achieved something that no one else had achieved, and that our achievement, we being the West, should be translated worldwide. And this, I hope you're hearing that this has very colonial, imperialistic implications. So, what is it that's so perfect about this system? Well, argues Fukuyama, sorry, it's hard to say his name sometimes. There are two main principles that we have established, tested again, and they have persisted, and these principles are the principles that make this system the best system we've ever had. And that is man's universal right to freedom and the consent of the governed. You will recall these are classical liberal principles that have, he's not wrong, persisted. We have continued to attempt to find and extend freedom. Having said so, as we've learned in this class, whose freedom is extended at whose cost is a whole other question. And indeed, this Fukuyama's position on the end of history and democracy, in particular liberal Western democracy, as the epitome of what we can achieve, completely flattens and negates any complexities and contradictions within Western liberal democracies. We have spent many weeks in this class implicitly talking about these ideas, especially in the latter half. We've talked about the decline of the welfare state. We've talked about how neoliberalism, which was in full force at the time he was writing this already, how it dehumanizes and completely commodifies all human life, turning us into economic units, not humans, not citizens who participate. We've talked about the environmental crisis that we have legitimately created through our consumption and overconsumption, and that our democratic systems have exacerbated. We have talked about feminism and patriarchy and the genuine, deep, divisive challenges that women continue to face in our societies. Fukuyama is not concerned with any of this. And these are criticisms with which he would have been familiar. These are not new criticisms. These have been around. The congratulatory tone of this piece makes it even more galling in some ways. But as he says, in this universal, homogeneous state, all prior contradictions are resolved, and all human needs are satisfied. There is no struggle over large issues, and consequently no need for generals or statesmen. What remains is primarily economic activity. At the heart of it, he's talking about liberty and freedom, but really that last phrase reveals sort of the hat trick he's engaging in. It reveals that he's actually talking about the neoliberal state. He is glorifying and validating neoliberal economic, anti-human, effectively, ideas about what it means to belong to a society. However, he doesn't see it that way. He really is quite persuaded, and persuading his audience of the same thing, that this system is actually the system that allows for the greatest pinnacle of human achievement that we have seen so far. The other challengers to political systems from the 20th century were fascism and communism. As he says, in 1989, fascism ended after World War II. That was it. There's no more fascism. Today we are having a very different conversation 30 years on about fascism and its reemergence and the reemergence of far-right political movements across the Western world. But even then, even in 1989, fascism still existed. Admittedly, there were no openly fascist states, well, not none. There was Spain under Franco. There was South Africa under apartheid. These were fascistic, if not openly fascist, states. And yet he's eluding that. He's creating a false narrative, an ahistorical narrative that presumes and imposes the idea that fascism is over and we will not return to it. Communism, well, he has to admit, at the time he's writing this, summer 1989, the Soviet Union still exists, and China is communist, and Cuba is communist, and North Korea is ostensibly communist. Communism still exists out in the world. But this is the end of the Cold War. And possibly presciently, he does see, and this is an accurate statement at the time, that communism's as a contender, as a challenger to Western liberalism, is no longer particularly challenging. Communism is declining. States are not stepping up and electing communist parties to power. In fact, the movement, historically at this point, has been, to a large degree, towards Western liberal democracies. All the newly independent nations in Africa in particular, and in Asia, that were colonized by the same Western powers that ostensibly created this perfect society, they all have at this point moved towards a version of Western democracy. How liberal those ideas are, how liberal, i.e., freedom promoting those democracies are, how equal they are, is a whole other conversation in which Fukuyama is not interested in participating. He does admit, though, that communism may have been onto something, specifically that Marx's critique that capital, as in wealth, as in those who own wealth, those who own the means of production, if you recall Marxist language, and labor, as in the proletariat, as in the workers, that they will continue to be conflict. He acknowledges that does seem to be accurate, that there are still these conflicts going on. However, he proposes, it's not because of the inherent class division and the inherent conflict between capital and labor. No, he says. If you look at the United States, there is economic inequality, but it is not based in the actual structure of the economy. It is not based in the contradictions of capitalism. It is based, he says, on historical institutions, like in the U.S., for instance, the legacy of slavery and ongoing oppression and racism. And to be fair, he's not wrong. Those are contributing factors. But to completely suggest that any group that finds itself economically unequal, which is frankly most of us, that inequality is rooted in historical trends rather than the actual market which has generated that equality seems a little disingenuous. It also seems strange to use the United States as the pinnacle of this kind of phenomenal achievement in democracy. 1989. We've just seen the Civil Rights Movement, which has just now, in 1989, just a few years earlier, had the Equal Rights Amendment passed into the Constitution. The so-called Red Power movement, so in the United States, they do call themselves Indians. In Canada, we wouldn't use Indian. We would use Indigenous or other forms of the term. But in the United States, American Indians have been pushing back, have been occupying, have been engaging in what the state has been calling terrorism in order to reclaim some of their power, their land, their autonomy. The United States is by no means a peaceable society. He's writing in 1989, a mere 20 years after the violent upheavals of the 1960s. He's writing in 1989, a decade that has seen unprecedented economic growth, but also unprecedented rises in violent crime, especially in the 70s. New York was a very dangerous place. The United States is not, even with his rose-colored glasses, a particularly rosy place to live for the vast majority of its citizens, which is why his argument that it is the epitome of human achievement becomes even ever more problematic the more we think about it. So he looks around the world and says, everyone's moving to this. This new model is where everybody is heading. Look, Asian states, Korea, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia. These are states that in some cases are new states. In other cases, like Japan, were under American occupation. He says they didn't seem likely candidates for Western liberal democracy. They were culturally different. They were embedded. For instance, Japan was definitely embedded in the global market since the 19th century. Some of these other countries were only just industrializing, but nonetheless, they didn't seem like it would be an organic fit. But, as he puts it, and as I put it, they are, at the end of the day, at the root of it, as greedy as the rest of us. End quote. Their desire for access to material culture has helped spread economic liberalism throughout Asia, and hence in promoting political liberalism as well. Nobody's saying there. Capitalism, which, as I've been arguing and we've been talking about in many different classes, is inherently in its structure a system of economic organization which generates inequality. But this same capitalism, framed as neoliberalism, that's what he means by economic liberalism, right? That is what he's literally talking about, the new liberalism, the liberalism that focuses on economic liberty, on the spread of so-called economic freedoms, is very attractive. People want to buy things. People want inexpensive goods. It is attractive, he says. And he argues that once you are part of this market, once you have access to these economic goods, well, very quickly after, political liberalism follows as well. The market comes first, and then human liberty follows, is his argument. How truthful that is, how well that corresponds to history is a whole other question. But in 1989, he points, for instance, to China, which is very much communist then and remains largely communist today, at least in its political structure. But even then, he says, it is liberalizing economically. It is moving into this new neoliberal global market. And therefore, he argues, political liberalism cannot be far behind. It's very easy to take an article that was written over 30 years ago and critique it because it doesn't follow historical trends that happen after. It's a bit of a straw man argument to do that. However, it isn't unfair to point out that the relationship that he argued for, the inherent relationship between economic liberalism and political liberalism, clearly isn't an inherent relationship. China is not politically liberal. China to this day continues to deny, for instance, the Tiananmen massacre. China continues to censor its internet usage and social media to its citizens. China continues to have very politically oppressive policies that are very far from liberal policies. So we can point to this element of his argument and say that history has proven him wrong here. But what I'm most interested in are the assumptions, why he is making an argument like this. The reason he's making an argument like this, really at the root of it, is because he is both justifying and valorizing Western imperialism. He is saying effectively what we have been doing in forcibly spreading these ideas, which is what much of the Cold War was about, has been a beneficial project for people everywhere. We've had hiccups. For instance, he says some people are religiously fundamentalist and don't like the ideas of liberalism. Indeed, he says that the revival of religion in some way attests to a broad unhappiness with the impersonality and spiritual vacuity of liberal consumer societies. He is very strongly signaling here that it's just Muslims who are unhappy with consumption. But let's pull back a step and move away from religious fundamentalism for a minute and take a look at that statement that he's making. He is acknowledging now, after having celebrated Western liberalism, after having said it is the end point of history because we have achieved human liberty to the greatest possible extent, he is acknowledging that it's spiritually empty, that basing your society around consumption is not a route to human happiness. Think of the contradiction between this idea that we've done it, we've achieved it, we've taken this model that we have developed and we have shoved it down everybody else's throat and we are the champions. But in fact, there's an existential question here of our model is pretty empty. It's vacuous. Consumption and production as the basis of society may not lead to human development. And so there's an interesting tension happening here. He also points out that nationalism might be an obstacle too, especially, he calls it nationalism. Really, it's mostly xenophobia, the idea that my country is better than any other country. And indeed, many states have variations of xenophobic practices and nationalisms, and many political projects are tied to nationalism, to exacerbating the tensions that nationalism creates. But nationalism itself is not really a problem, he says, because nationalist projects basically just say as I just said, that my country is better. But that in itself isn't in contradiction with these liberal values. Right? So once effectively we give them liberalism, because really that is what he's promoting. He is promoting the spread of liberalism, which seems to be a contradiction in terms. If you think about the ideas of liberalism, how can you force someone else to be free? Freedom ought to come from within the society, not from outside. But once we give them this liberal idea, once we show them how to adapt it, it fits within the nationalist project as well. So that's not really an obstacle here. So, we have the endpoint of history. We have this most perfect system we have ever devised in liberal democracy based on capitalism and consumption. But what is the goal? Does this bring human happiness? That's a really big question, actually, and one that is not asked often enough of a political philosophy, which this obviously is. This is a vision of a political philosophy. Does it bring human happiness? And Fukuyama has a pretty good answer to that, an answer that in many ways is, I think, disturbing. He writes, "The end of history will be a very sad time. The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination, and idealism will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands." This, to me, is actually probably the most compelling part of his argument. The rest of his argument rests on imperialist ideas about spreading Western liberalism by hook or by crook to the rest of the world and imagining that this will give everyone else liberty somehow. But this piece that he recognizes, that what we've achieved, this achievement of liberal Western democracy, is actually turning human creativity, human endeavor, humanity, human life into absences. It is taking all of the qualities that made us dynamic, that made us change into something, daring, courage, imagination, idealism. This idea that we could be better, then the world we have is not the world we must have, and it needs to stay that way, that we can change this way. This idea of Western liberal capitalism and the neoliberal order, which he's describing, take that from us. They void us of all of these characteristics. They leave us with a world where our biggest concerns are, as he says, technical problems, environmental concerns, and figuring out how to make better and more interesting stuff so that we can buy better stuff. I think there's something very compelling and also chilling in this vision. And to me, it reads as accurate. When we allow neoliberalism to become dominant, when we allow it to become the only way we think, when we allow it to become common sense, which he thinks we've already done at this point in 1989, we lose much more than just alternatives. We lose the ability to imagine, envision a better world because we become only economic creatures whose only interest is in resolving and solving an economic desire. We cease to have spiritual needs. We cease to have intellectual striving. We become only economic creatures. And he realizes this. He says there will be neither art nor philosophy, just the perpetual caretaking of the Museum of Human History. I can see in myself and in others around me a powerful nostalgia for the time when history existed. Such nostalgia, in fact, will continue to fuel competition conflict even in post-historical world for some time to come. Even though I recognize its inevitability, I have the most ambivalent feelings for the civilization that has been created in Europe since 1945, with its North Atlantic and Asian offshoots. Perhaps this very prospect of centuries of boredom at the end of history will serve to get history started again. Of the whole article, most of which I really deeply disagree with fundamentally because I think it's a imperial project disguised as benevolence, this last argument that this neoliberal world is one of actually existential boredom. That when you you take away all the other elements of social and human life and replace them with economic drives only, which more or less is what he's admitting we are doing, we face centuries of boredom. Now, does that mean that history ends? And by history, he does mean dynamic change, is what he means by history here. He's arguing that we will stop changing. Our societies will become futuristic visions of our current societies where not much has socially changed. We have just become better and better consumers. It is, at the end, a lament. But it's a lament that speaks to nostalgia, for competition and conflict, which is also in many ways chilling, especially as you consider what the 20th century had wrought. 2 world wars, a Cold War lasting 40 years, imperialism and colonialism across most of the world, which did end during the 20th century, but that's how the century began. I'm not sure that nostalgia for these things is the right way to go either. But Fukuyama is in a bit of existential despair over this wonderful thing that we have brought. So he says, it is over. But maybe it's not over completely. Maybe we'll get so bored that we'll start conflict again, and thus start up history. So that's Francis Fukuyama's argument. It is less rarely read today because that vision of unprecedented success of the Western liberal model and the vision of optimism that his ideas carry has not fit very well with where we have gone in the last 25 years. Our world has changed dramatically from the one he saw. The decade after he wrote this, the 90s, did see a proliferation of democratic states emerging as the former Soviet republics and satellite states often and usually turned to a version of democracy, some more robust than others. But looking at this text now, rereading it in 2018, what I see here is a wish, an existential wish for a different world. One that was never possible then, one that didn't exist even as he was describing it and claiming it into existence, and certainly one that doesn't exist today. So let's take a look at a very alternate idea, at another vision of the world as it was then and the prediction of the future. Clash of Civilizations, also with a question mark, by Samuel Huntington. So, in 1993, 4 years after Francis Fukuyama's widely well-received article, Samuel Huntington, a scholar, a political scientist, writes this article called The Clash of Civilizations, question mark, and it posits a very, very different vision of the world than the one that Fukuyama saw. It is as popular and perceived to be as compelling as well. In many ways, it also is aspirational in a way. But we're going to take a look at what it is he says, and we're going to contrast the two visions. So, Francis Fukuyama had put history to bed, had lamented over its demise, had held a funeral procession for it. Huntington is here to save the day. He's going to rescue history because, he says, history is happening, history is dynamic, it is not over. In fact, he says, and there's this sort of undercurrent of almost excitement in his article, if you read it between the lines a little bit. In fact, we are now entering a new era of civilizational conflict. So, Huntington says, previously, we had conflict in the 20th century over ideas. Fascism versus democracy in World War II, communism versus democracy in the Cold War. They were ideological clashes. The future is going to be different. The future is going to be about, as he says, conflict between civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. Fukuyama was imperialist and Eurocentric in his claims. Huntington, though, takes the idea of culture and the idea of cultural groupings, if you want to call it that, and reifies them down, distills them into things that are unchangeable, immovable, and inherently different. And we're going to take a look at sort of what makes that a fairly racist claim. So, in order to get there, Huntington has to define civilizations for us. A concept that anytime someone speaks of civilizations, a red flag should go up for you. Right now, the people speaking of civilizations are white nationalists. That is no accident. Civilization is a code word. It is a term that reveals more while obscuring a lot as well than it intends to. Those who speak of civilizations are those who see the world drawn in difference, not in commonality. There are those who see that difference as irrefutable, but also impossible to overcome. Those who see the world in such black and white, often quite literally, terms speak of civilizations. There is no such thing as civilization. Huntington has to create this idea effectively, has to fill it in with content. He has to put something into that very empty and open bucket of concepts that it has been filled with before in order to move forth this argument. So he claims a civilization is a collection of people who, at the most abstraction from their small local communities, have common objective elements such as language, history, religion, customs, institutions, and are also joined by the subjective self-identification of people. This seems in some ways to be a common sense definition. The trouble is, though, that it's defining something that doesn't exist. People have shared languages. There's no denying that. People have languages with which they identify more than another. Many of us speak multiple languages, but one of those languages is our primary language. History, yes, people have shared history. Groups of peoples have shared history. Likewise with religion, customs, and institutions. Those are markers of something. Other scholars claim that that's what defines a nation. An ethnic group has a shared language, a history, often religion, institutions, shared memory. That is a concept that exists. We do have ethnic groups. We have people who self-identify as nations. But to claim from that baseline that we self-identify as parts of civilizations is to take a sociological phenomenon like ethnicity or nation, which are distinct and not the same necessarily, and to turn it into a much larger idea that is much more abstract and void of really any meaning. And I'll show you this, and it matters when we look at what ostensibly these civilizations are. So firstly, there's Western civilization. And that's not a new concept. Western civilization has existed the moment we needed to define ourselves as superior vis-a-vis a group of people whom we wanted to oppress, i.e. through inferiority. So when the slave trade takes off in the 16th century, we create the idea of Western culture. It does not exist before then. Confucian is ostensibly Chinese. Shared language is hard to argue in either of these, since Western culture encompasses hundreds of languages. Confucian culture, maybe Confucian culture is a concept. Maybe that's a concept. I'm not even persuaded that Confucian culture is a concept. But Confucian civilization is not a thing. People who are defined as Confucian in this way have much less in common with one another than he presumes. Japanese are distinct and unto themselves. Here he's conflating culture, ethnicity, nation, and civilization, and somehow they all end up meaning the same thing. There's also, he claims, an Islamic civilization, a Hindu one, a Slavic Orthodox, a Latin American one, and he says possibly an African one. That's a direct quote from the article. Possibly African. He is not certain that compared to the other groups he's identified, people whom he frames as African, what that even means I'm not certain, have a civilization. Think of the implications of that. Think of the implications of saying these groups of people have very, apparently, he claims, shared characteristics that define them into commonality. But if you come from Southern Africa, I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure if you count enough to be considered a civilization. Right? The ground on which he's created these ideas is very shaky to begin with. But he reveals a lot in proposing that African culture, which not even really a thing, isn't a civilization. And take a look at the breakdown of the so-called civilizations. You will see that we are really talking about skin tone. Every different civilization is marked by ostensibly different appearance. Somehow his civilizations correspond to a racial hierarchy. When you observe that and absorb his idea that these differences lead to conflict, you suddenly have the argument of many a racist in the past who has proposed separate but equal, as has been said, as the in American South was the argument for education. That if we are different, we should not have to coexist. We should not have to tolerate each other's difference. We are entitled to feel that that difference separates us. So, why are we going to focus on these differences? Why now? Well, he's got a few reasons. Firstly, he argues in 93 nation states are weakening. And instead of national identities, we're now getting more and more fundamentalist visions, especially religious fundamentalism. Note that both Fukuyama and Huntington, coming at a similar question from very different angles, posit and argue that religious fundamentalism is a problem. But when they speak of religious fundamentalism, they are not talking about Christian fundamentalism. They are not talking about Hindu fundamentalism either. They are usually implicitly speaking of Muslim fundamentalism. Both these arguments are problematic because they are premised upon a vision of people being different on one hand in Huntington, on the other hand in Fukuyama as similar in that we are all economic creatures. But in both these visions, those who are left out are these ostensibly problematic not Western, but other Muslims in particular. There's no room in this argument for seeing someone who practices a faith system, even in a fundamentalist way, for seeing them as equally vested in human rights, in liberty. There's no room there. Another reason why this is going to happen is because the West is less powerful than it used to be. So, effectively, it's less able to impose its own vision on the world. Right? And, God forbid, but other countries want to have a say in how they will govern themselves and in how the global economy and market and international dimensions in politics will be governed. And he finds that problematic. He, in a way, agrees with Fukuyama that as long as the West was powerful, which Fukuyama thought was still true, the West imposing imperialistically its vision outside of itself and replicating its own value systems, its own institutions in other countries, they both think that's a good thing. They both think that it introduces stability, that it is a better system to have. Really, it's a nostalgia for colonialism, is really what it's speaking to. And the final reason why we're all going to clash with one another is that our cultural identities are fixed, solid, immutable. They don't change, he argues. They just are and have been and will be. Think about that. Think about your own life. Many of us in this room, well, we're in separate rooms today, but normally in one room at the same time together, come from ourselves migrants, or our parents were immigrants. We all identify and probably have ethnic identities other than the Canadian national identity. I, for one, am born in Poland. My ethnic identity is ostensibly Polish. How I practice that identity, how I engage with it, how I think about that identity is very, very different than how my parents perceive their ostensibly same identity. We have a shared history, shared language, literally, and yet we practice, engage with, embody that identity very, very differently. Cultural identity changes. It changes from person to person. It changes from generation to generation. It is very dynamic. It is not a thing in the world that always exists. It is a part of our social interactions with other human beings. But if you decide, as Huntington clearly has, that cultural identity is permanent in a way, immutable, and that because of these cultural identities we will be clashing, then you introduce fear. And for Huntington, most frightening is the, quote, centuries-old military interaction between the West and Islam, which is, quote, unlikely to decline and indeed could become more virulent. If we accept his arguments uncritically, which we obviously are not doing, but if you were to do so, one might find in Huntington an explanation of how the world has changed since 1993. One might find, indeed, the reason behind the current war, ongoing war in Afghanistan and Syria, ISIS, all of these conflicts. One might perceive in them the root cause of civilizational clash. But to do that, one would have to accept all the assumptions he's making about people's motivations, people's connections. One would have to imagine that these large, immense, in fact, groupings of people have a lot in common and nothing in common with the rest of us. You'd have to accept all of that in order to accept this argument. So let's take a look at a few different examples. We're not going to spend too much time on them, but I just want to illustrate the point of conflict within so-called civilizational groups. Because you have to explain that away, don't you, in order to accept this idea of civilizations clashing with one another. For instance, Muslims and Christians in Nigeria have been in violent conflict and confrontation. In particular, Boko Haram has grown significantly over the last decade or so. Nigerians, whether you're Igbo, Yoruba, you're Black African, it's Sub-Saharan Africa, according to Huntington, you are part of the same ostensibly possible African civilization. So why would people within one civilization come into conflict? The answer is because civilization has nothing to do with conflict. Conflict is born out of many, many complex interrelated issues. But fundamentally, political violence of the nature of war, usually, is explainable when you look at elites manipulating the idea of identity in order to foster conflict. Is explainable when you look at the division of economic resources and inequitable access to power. When you look at other domains, other places where conflict emerges, you start seeing many, many reasons why there is war. None of them having anything to do with ostensible civilizations. An example that seems to support Huntington's claim here, is that the violence in Bosnia and Sarajevo in the 1990s. Bosniaks were Muslim predominantly, and the Serbs and Croats were Orthodox Christian. This fits his paradigm. It suggests that it was their difference that led to the conflict. That is not the case. The conflict was rooted in, again, inequitable access, was rooted in political elites manipulating the ideas of ethnicity in order to generate the idea of difference, and then use that idea of difference in order to foster conflict. Likewise, Pakistan and India. In each one of these cases, although Pakistan and India are ostensibly against civilizational conflict, one being Hindu, the other being Muslim, he would see in that conflict, ongoing conflict still at the border, in the Kashmir province in particular, he would see in that evidence for his claim. Any of you who know about Indian and Pakistani relations and politics will know that it is not about civilizations clashing. It is about minorities being oppressed. It is about some groups having less access to power. It's about, fundamentally, at its root, it's about power. Who has it and who doesn't. Not about culture. Foundational claim he's making here as well is in many ways parallel to Fukuyama's, that we here in the West, we've got this thing figured out. We have an identity, we have a shared civilization, And all of these other civilizations are going to come into conflict with our civilization. Not because what they say is true, which is that the West has been using organizations like the IMF, World Bank, UN Security Council to enforce its power, impose its vision on the world. That's not why. That's not why. Even though a lot of these so-called complainants, I'll use that language, point out to Western imperialism and hegemony as a real problem, that's not why we're going to come into conflict. Nope. Huntington says it's because these ideas we have of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty and the rule of law, democracy, free market, separation of church and state, all of these things, these ideas that make us so superior, have little resonance in Islamic, Confucian, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist, or Orthodox cultures. In other words, if you are Muslim, you don't care for liberty, human rights, rule of law, democracy. Those things don't appeal to you. If you are Confucian, you don't care about constitutionalism, you don't care about individualism. Think about it. It basically takes the ideas of human rights and self-governance and says only we understand them, only we appreciate them. The rest of you, your cultures prevent you from appreciating, understanding, desiring human rights. It is fundamentally at the root of it, Huntington's argument, frankly, a pretty openly racist claim about the cultural incompatibility of all of these different groups. We have human rights, democracy, freedoms. You have your cultures. That is where the clash comes in. And finally, he wraps up with the claim that, we're going to need to keep our military strong because other countries are going to be attacking us. We can try to get along with them, but at the end of it, we'll likely get into wars. Which really isn't saying anything useful, given that every war the United States has participated in the 20th century has been a war of invasion, where the U.S. has gone to another land, somewhere else, to fight someone else. The U.S. has not been invaded. It was attacked at Pearl Harbor once, and if you accept 9/11 as an act of war, which is debatable, but if you do, then that would be the second time. Every other time the United States takes the war elsewhere. So this idea that we need a powerful military in order to protect ourselves from them completely misreads and misremembers the history of the 20th century. So, I've kind of been talking about this throughout, and so I'm not going to spend too much time on this final question, this final section of where are these arguments now. I'm going to pinpoint a few points about how flawed the arguments were when they were formulated, how problematic the implications are, and how little they actually describe reality. So, you might think of 9/11, that event whereby a terrorist organization brought terror to American soil. You might look at that and you might think they were Muslim, they were fundamentalist Muslim. They objected to the United States on the grounds of its cultural identity and its history. This seems to correspond to Huntington's argument. You might look at it differently. You might look at Fukuyama and say, this group, Al-Qaeda, it seems to be rejecting these liberal virtues that you said everyone would want. It seems to be rejecting a world based on consumerism and based on common dependency through trade. You might look at 9/11 and see it supporting one of the two visions. There are many ways to look at the events of 9/11. I'm going to propose just one. When the terrorists crashed the planes into the Twin Towers on September 11th, 2001, they wanted it to be framed as an act of war. But we had a choice of how we would read that moment. We had a political choice to make. We could have seen their act of destructive political violence as a crime, not an act of war. We could have charged them in international criminal court with committing a crime against humanity. Instead, we chose, and this was a choice, to interpret the act as an act of war. This is the point. What appears to be self-evident from the outside is not self-evident at all. How events are interpreted and narrated after the fact determines what they become. They are not in and of themselves inherently something. They are reinterpreted every time we think through these ideas. The Arab Spring of 2014, when suddenly in one spring, people all over the so-called Muslim fundamentalist Arab world stepped up and said, we want liberty, we want freedom, we want democracy, we want human rights, we want our politicians to represent us, we want freedoms of all sorts, starting with the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. These are the things we want. Quite contrary to Huntington, isn't it? Huntington, who imagined that these ideas were incompatible with Islamic culture. In fact, they came from within Islamic culture. People used, in many instances during this Arab Spring, used their Islamic faith-based teaching to justify and push for liberty. The Arab Spring serves to remind us that Huntington's vision of the world is a deeply flawed, very imperialistic, racist vision that assumes that whole swaths of human people do not want the basic things that we get. Other responses to this narrative of the clash of civilizations or the end of history, and there have been quite a few since these narratives were written, come from different domains. For instance, when President Obama was actively at war in Afghanistan and Iraq, not personally obviously, when his country was at war, he was very careful to not articulate it as a civilizational clash. In fact, he intentionally spoke in opposition to this idea of civilizational clash. He said, quote, "But the notion that the West is at war with Islam is an ugly lie," he said. And all of us, regardless of our faith, have a responsibility to reject it. As his country was at war with a Muslim country. And the wars that we're talking about, we should critique, we should actively critique, we should question the merit, we should question the rationales for them. But what we cannot do is accept that they were wars over civilization. They were not. These were conflicts over many things, among them the military-industrial complex. Another one, access to markets, in particular oil markets. Another one, frankly, justification why war in Afghanistan and Iraq. George H.W. Bush was nearly assassinated by Saddam Hussein. His son, and I do believe this, wanted to get revenge. I think that's a minor reason why the war happened. There are much greater ones. But none of these reasons are about Clash of Civilizations. Clash of Civilizations is a tidy, neat, racist package that we cannot accept. The other arguments against, in this case, the end of history, are quite interesting as well. We've got one by Glaser here, who writes that we are facing a different kind of end of history. Not the triumph of Western liberal capitalism and democracy, as Fukuyama said. No, what we are seeing, what will bring on the end of history, is that device on which you are likely watching this right now. Our phones, our technologies. This, he argues, is going to lead to the end of history. So we haven't finished arguing about what brings about the end of history. We like making these pronouncements. But argues Glaser, technology is the real problem, or benefit, depending on how you view it, not liberal democracy. Others really, truly lament the loss of the vision that Fukuyama had. As I pointed out, it was a triumphant idea. It was, in many ways, celebratory, even as it lamented at the end its own demise. Stanley and Lee are troubled that the world that Fukuyama saw, in which they evidently believed, has ended. And they write that most disturbingly, the connection between capitalism, democracy, and liberalism, upon which Fukuyama's argument depended, has itself been broken. In the wake of the credit crunch and the global economic downturn of 2008, it has become increasingly clear that prosperity is not, in fact, best served either by the pursuit of laissez-faire economics, i.e. neoliberalism, or by the inexorable extension of economic freedoms. Indeed, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. They're making a similar claim to what I proposed during our neoliberalism lecture, that the extension of neoliberal policies does not lead to greater freedom. It leads to the dehumanization of people and greater inequality. History is far from over. History is continuing. And with that, folks, I'm going to wrap up this lecture today. It is a much shorter one than we normally do, in some ways because the content is more straightforward, but also we didn't have the opportunity for discussion. I would, however, encourage you strongly to work through and consider point by point, argument by argument, what these two writers are saying. Their arguments are compelling. Their arguments refuse to die in many ways, and keep being resuscitated to explain the world and the way it is right now. I propose to you that their arguments are both deeply, deeply flawed arguments, resting on troubling assumptions about the nature of our existence and reality. You could reach your own conclusions, and you should reach your own conclusions, but you ought to understand the argument well. And on that note, I'm going to wrap up. See you next week.